Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's good to see you here today. It's always fun on a holiday to see who went, who came. It's good to see so many visitors this morning. We hope you'll stay a few minutes after and just chat. We'd love to talk to you. I do apologize. You're entering right in the middle of a series, so I can't do anything about that. You're just going to hopefully be able to catch up to us as we come along here. I really appreciated the song Andrew had there at the end right before I got up. He doesn't know it, but it's going to very much play into what we speak about today. We've been on a series about the why questions of life. The big questions, the questions that keep us up at night. Why do the innocent suffer? Why does the Bible say that God hates someone? Why is it God allows people to be mistreated? We've been looking at the hard questions of life by looking at the hard stories of Scripture. And for the last week, and we're on week 2 now, and it will be going into next week, we've been looking at probably the hardest question, and that is, why does God allow suffering? Whenever you go out and you look at a study, why people don't believe in God or why they don't go to church, why they're not Christians, almost universally at the top of the list is the topic of pain, evil, and suffering. Why would a good God allow people to suffer? And unfortunately, Christians have a habit of trying to gloss over that question, just not dealing with it. We'll say little trite answers about why it is that why God allows suffering. It'll be something easy, like, well, God works in mysterious ways, or, maybe they did something to deserve it, or maybe we'll say something like, well, it's not about the suffering, it's about eternity. And there is some truth in all those things, but the fact of the matter is it's a difficult question and it deserves a proper answer. So we are looking at the question of why we suffer by looking at the book of the Bible that deals with the topic of suffering, the book of Job, the story of Job, a man who suffers a whole lot. And he himself asks the question many times, God, why is it this is happening to me? I didn't do anything to deserve it. Why are you allowing me to go through all this? Now, last week we looked at the beginning of Job. We looked at his suffering, what he went through, and we went through most of what's called the first cycle of speeches. Job's story is told in 3 cycles of speeches and then a 4th answer by Elihu and God. And in the first cycle of speeches, there's the opening arguments, if you will, by Job's friends. And their arguments basically boil down to, Job, bad things only happen to bad people. And since bad things are happening to you, you must be a bad guy. It's not a good argument, but it's also a familiar one. It's one that unfortunately gets thrown around a lot by people who think they're doing good. They think they're giving a nice, righteous answer, but they're not really dealing with the hard question of suffering. And Job's response throughout it was basically, no, I'm not evil. I haven't done anything wrong. I don't understand why this is happening to me. But last week we ended on a positive note. At one point, Job cries out, there is no arbiter between me and God. And our note of positivity was that we do now have an arbiter between us and God in Christ. That's a wonderful thing. It's a hopeful thing, but one thing I don't want to give anyone the impression of is that Job thought it was hopeful. Job, when he cries out, there is no arbiter between us, it is very much a statement of despair for him. Christ has not come yet. Christ will not come for many thousands of years still. Job, when he cries out in a place of darkness. So when we start today and we look at more of Job's speeches, you have to understand, Job is not happy. We might have ended on hope, but he does not have hope yet. He is still in pain. And he starts out the next section in Job chapter 10 with something that sounds kind of positive. It almost sounds like a praise psalm, something you might hear David say in one of the Psalms. He says, you clothed me with skin and flesh and knit me together with bones and sinews. You have granted me life and steadfast love, and your care has preserved my spirit. That sounds wonderful, doesn't it? That almost sounds like I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Or what is man that you are mindful of him? It's something you could see being inserted into the Psalms, but the problem is Job does not mean this necessarily in a positive manner. Because see, to Job, this is a statement of confusion. God, I know you took time to craft me. I know you intricately wove my parts. Why then are you allowing this to happen to me? If you took such care in making me, why is it you are allowing me to be destroyed? And so later on, Job will have what is probably one of the saddest statements in Scripture. Why did you bring me out from the womb? Would that I had died before any eye had seen me, and were as though I had not been, carried from the womb to the grave. Job cries out to God, why did you make me? Was it just so I could suffer all of this? Did you give me all these good things? Did you take your time in crafting me just so there could come a moment where you could steal it all away? Why would you do this to me, God? Now, I've been fortunate in my life. I don't think I've ever cried out to God, why did you make me? But I know that there are those who have. Maybe even those in this very room who have cried out that question. God, why did you make me if this is all you're going to let me go through? If my life is going to be such torment, why did you bother? It's a question that gets cried out in dark places. Not often in front of people like Job. Job is an exceptional case here, but it is something that is common, especially among those who are struggling in life. Those who perhaps were born with debilitating diseases. Those who have lost their family or their livelihood. They look up and they ask God, what's the point of me being here if this is what you're going to do to me? Now, I hope that if any of us have been around to answer someone who's going through that, I hope we did not give the answer that Zophar, Job's third friend, is going to give Job here. Zophar, like Bildad before him, we saw last week, is not really nice to Job. Zophar's reply to Job is, should your babble silence men, and when you mock shall no one shame you? For you say, my doctrine is pure, and I am clean in God's eyes. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips to you, and that he would tell you the secrets of wisdom, for he is manifold in understanding. And then Zophar says something really awful. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. Now take a moment to consider this. Job has lost everything. Job has lost his health. He has lost his family. He has lost his livelihood. He's lost his status. What else exactly could God take away from Job at this point? He could kill him, but Job's actually asked God to do that. I don't think Job would consider that to be any more condemnation than he already has. So what in the world is Zophar saying? How could he come to Job and say, know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves? You're getting less than you deserve, Job. Well, Zophar, like his friends before him, is stuck in a worldview. It's a narrow worldview. And unfortunately, it's one that many Christians even fall into. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. Job, if this is happening to you, it's because you're a bad person, and therefore, God should do whatever he wants. Now, Zophar is not really thinking about this question, because I don't think Zophar, if he were asked, would say, I'm perfect. And if he really were to consider what he's saying, he would realize that were this turned back on himself, he would not come out looking so good. But in a moment, he has a very self-righteous answer. You're not good, Job. And so you're getting exactly what you deserve. And before we tut Zophar, maybe we should look at our own lives and ask, do we ever do the same? Now, I hope we've never been so rude as Zophar to say this to somebody's face, but have you ever seen the struggling single mother? Her kids are not dressed well. She looks tired and dirty. You know that she's not giving them the meals they need. You know that she is constantly out and about, and you kind of make a judgment on her. You make the judgment that you should be doing better. You should get your life in order. If you did, everything would be better for you. But the problem is, do you know what she's doing in the dark? Do you know if she's struggling through life? Do you know if she spends her days driving 2-3 hours to work just so she can put the meager food she does put on the table for her kids? Do you know if she has hand-me-down clothes because she cannot afford to buy anything else? Do you know if the reason her kids look ratty and kind of disorganized is because the water was turned off at their house last week because she doesn't have the money to keep it on? It's really easy to make judgments from afar. It's really easy to just take a glance at someone's life and say, well, the reason you're in this mess is because you've made bad choices. And hey, there's some truth to the fact that our choices matter. There's truth that if we sin, sometimes that comes back to bite us. But there's also some truth that sometimes we suffer and there was no real reason for it. Sometimes we're the people who get behind the wheel of a car and make a bad choice and crash, but sometimes we're the people who get behind the wheel of a car and someone else runs into us. We need to be very careful about the judgments we make on other people. Zophar is sure. He has his worldview, and he's applying it to Job. And in Zophar's worldview, it's logical, it's consistent, it makes sense. Job, you must be bad. But the problem is Zophar is wrong. Job has not done anything. Job does not deserve anything that he's going through. In fact, it is Job's righteousness that has brought about his own destruction. So Zophar, even though it sounds like he's giving good answers, he's really speaking falsely. And we'll talk about why that's a big deal as we go forward. But Zophar continues on. He has one little piece of advice for Job. It sounds, again, kind of holy. It sounds kind of biblical, but it's not. He says, if you prepare your heart, you will stretch out your hands towards him. If iniquity is in your hand, put it far away, and let not injustice dwell in your tents. Surely then you will lift up your face without blemish. You will be secure and will not fear. You will forget your misery. You will remember it as waters that have passed away. Zophar tells Job, look, if you just be good, then everything will be fine again. You'll get everything back. And you know what? That sounds nice. It would be a wonderful world if we could tell who was good and who was bad by how things were going in their life. If we could look at someone and say, well, it looks like you're struggling, therefore you must be wicked. Or it looks like you've been blessed, therefore you must be good. But the fact of the matter is, we know that's not true. There are plenty of people we know are wicked, and they have, at least on the surface, every material success they could hope for. And Job, well, there was no one more blameless than him in his day. And yet he is at the bottom. He has been destroyed. Job's answer to Zophar is basically in line with that. He says, in the thought of one who is at ease, there is contempt for misfortune. It is ready for those whose feet slip. Basically, he says to Zophar, that's really easy for you to say to me from a 10,000-foot view. It's really easy to say, hey, if you had turned this way and not that way, everything would be fine for you. Zophar, in Job's eyes, is basically someone running up to a gunshot victim and telling them, hey, you shouldn't have been in front of that bullet. Is it true? I mean, sure, I guess. I mean, yeah. But does it do anybody any good now that you've been shot? No, that doesn't do you any good. Once the bullet hits you, it no longer matters what you could have done to not get hit by the bullet. You've been struck. And yet Zophar, like so many of us, wants to diagnose the issue that led to the bullet hitting us, rather than dealing with the pain and the suffering that's going on now. Job goes on. The next chapter, he says something. He's addressing all his friends. He says, as for you, you whitewash with lies. Worthless physicians are you all. Oh, that you would keep silent and it would be your wisdom. Basically, you guys would sound a lot smarter if you just shut up. Verse 12, he says, your maxims are proverbs of ashes, your defenses are defenses of clay. Job is saying something that unfortunately all too often applies to Christians. You're trying to give me easy answers for something that cannot be easily explained. You're trying to get out of this problem. You're trying not to have to think too hard about it by just throwing your cliches at me. But the problem is, when those cliches are put up against reality, they don't stand the test. They're not true. This is one of the big problems when we go with easy answers to a world that is in pain. Eventually, they realize the answers you gave me, though they sounded nice, though they sounded easy, they're not true. I did try to change my life for the better. I did try to follow God, and I'm still struggling. So what you told me is not true. Or I look out and I see that someone who I know is wicked, I know is not following God, just signed a massive record deal with a company. They will have everything they ever wanted and more. So I know what you're telling me is not true. There's more to the story. The answer is not so easy. But then, out of nowhere, Job has this burst of hope. It's kind of weird. As you're reading the story, it's almost like Job just has an epiphany in a moment. And don't mistake me for saying that Job gets happy all of a sudden. He doesn't. He's going to be in a dark place for a long while. But Job has this burst of hope. He looks up to God, and he basically asks God for something. He says, "Oh, that you would hide me in Sheol, that you would conceal me until your wrath be past, that you would appoint me a set time and remember me. If a man dies, shall he live again? All the days of my service I would wait till my renewal should come. You would call and I would answer you. You would long for the work of your hands." And a little later on he says, "My transgression would be sealed up in a bag, and you would cover over my iniquity." Job, unlike his friends, is beginning to remember an aspect of God. See, Job's friends, they've been speaking about God, and we have to say, not everything they say about God is false. In fact, a lot of what Job's friends say is correct, but they're only painting half a picture of God. The God that they present to Job, the answers they present to Job, they are wrath and justice and judgment. They are God's perfection and holiness, and all those things are true, but they have left out important pieces of God. That God is merciful as well. That God is loving as well. That He is gracious and kind. They can't seem to find those parts of God, but Job right now, he's remembering, though my friends have not helped me in this matter, God, I do remember that you are gracious and kind, that you are merciful. So he looks up to God and he says, "Oh, that you would hide me away from your wrath until the time comes when it is past. Then you might call me back, and in that moment, you could forget my sin. You could pass over, you could wrap it up and throw it away." In that moment, Job is the one, not Job's friends, Job is the one who is nearest to the mind of God. How do we know that? Well, because this is exactly what God said He's going to do. In Jeremiah, God speaks of the coming day when He is going to take away the sin of the world, and He says, "For I will forgive their iniquity and I will remember their sin no more." Basically, the exact same thing Job asked God to do. Job is remembering God's mercy, and that's something we need to remember when we talk about suffering. Any answer to suffering has to remember that our God is merciful. If it does not, then it's not a good answer. If it's not, it's going to be missing a key component. Our God is merciful, but there's more to that as well. If we only have an answer of judgment and wrath, if we are fire and brimstone alone, there's also a warning in that. We'll talk about that here as we go forward. But I want you to keep it in mind. I want you to keep in mind the fact that to bring only judgment to someone, though it kind of sounds holy, though it kind of sounds like you're honoring God, it actually puts us directly in the way of God. The second cycle begins, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on Job's friends in these coming cycles, because as you read through Job's friends' words, you realize they're basically one-track ponies. It's just repeating the same thing in different variations. They can't get over the idea that only bad people have bad things happen to them. It's stuck in there. Anything else will not fit into their worldview. And so they're going to say a lot of things that really is not worth repeating, because we would just be repeating. But we will look briefly at a couple things they say, because it impacts Job's response, and it rebukes us when we would go to others and offer a bad answer. Eliphaz begins the second cycle in a much harsher way than he began the first. In the first cycle, Eliphaz was kind of nice. He said some wrong things, but he was kind of trying to be nice to Job. He was tiptoeing around the subject. He's not doing that anymore. Now he's going to be straightforward with Job. He says, "For your iniquity teaches your mouth, and you choose the tongue of the crafty. Your own mouth condemns you, and not I. Your own lips testify against you." Basically, he says to Job, "Job, look, you're a liar. If you were actually innocent, this wouldn't be happening to you. So stop saying that you're innocent. Stop saying you didn't do anything wrong. You have to have done something wrong, because it's the only thing that makes sense in my worldview." And Job's answer is one of my favorite lines in Scripture. He says, "I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all." Miserable comforters. It's almost an oxymoron. Miserable comforters. You guys are terrible at this. He goes on a little later, "I could also speak as you do if you were in my place. I could join words together against you and shake my head at you. It's so easy to be right when you're not in the fire. It's so easy to see clearly when you're not the one getting hurt. It's so easy to stand over the gunshot victim and say you shouldn't have been standing in the way of the bullet when you're not the one in pain. But what good does that do me? How does that help me in my moment? How does that help me in my affliction?" Job's response then provokes Bildad. Bildad is not a nice one. Bildad is a little keener in his responses, and his sword is sharp. He's been waiting for this time of judgment to give people a piece of his righteous mind, or at least self-righteous mind. Bildad goes on this long description of what happens to the wicked. And the reason he gives this description is pretty clear. "Job, all these things are happening to you. Therefore, you must be wicked." One of the examples he says is, "Indeed, the light of the wicked is put out, and the flame of his fire does not shine. The light is dark in his tent, and his lamp above him is put out." Basically, there's no hope in the life of the wicked. It's snuffed out. Their comfort, their safety, it's removed from them. Job has had his comfort and safety removed. He has been laid bare. "Therefore, Job, you must be wicked." And Job's response is, "How long will you torment me and break me in pieces with words? What good does it do me for you to tell me I should not have been standing there? It already happened." And then he goes on to say, even if it's true that I've sinned, even if you're exactly right, have I not paid for it? Is this suffering not payment for what I did? Is it not enough that I have lost everything? A little later he goes on and he says desperately something that everyone in this room needs to pay attention to. Whether you are the person who goes through suffering or who is answering suffering. In the moment when we are hurting, in the moment when we are in trial, what we need is not someone diagnosing the issue. We need someone with a helping hand. Job cries out, "Have mercy on me, have mercy on me, you my friends, for the hand of God has touched me." Now, Job's not right about that. Job's actually wrong. God is not the one doing this to him. But he thinks that's what's happening. And whether he's right or wrong about that, the fact remains the job of his friends is supposed to be comfort. And instead, they're trying to wound him further. And so he touches on that. He says, "Why do you, like God, pursue me? Why are you not satisfied with my flesh? Why is it that whatever God's judgment on me is, why is that not enough for you? Why do you feel the need to drive me further into the ground?" You know, the church has for a very long time, maybe not so much in the last 20 or 30 years, but for a very long time, it had a reputation of being a place of judgment, a place of fire and brimstone, a place where you come in and we tell you exactly what's wrong with you. And make no mistake, there's a time to talk about sin. There's a time to talk about bad choices in life. There's a time to tell people, hey, you need to get out of the fire. But when someone is in suffering, when someone is in deep pain, what they need is comfort. What they need is someone to lift them up. If we look at someone in deep affliction who feels as if God has abandoned them, and our answer to that is you're getting exactly what you deserve, why in the world do you think they would want to turn around and serve that God? Why do you think they would want to turn around and get right with a God that they think is destroying them right now? And yet so often that's our answer. You wouldn't be in this position if it wasn't for your sin. Who does that help in a moment of deep sorrow? Is there a time to deal with sin? Absolutely. Is there a time to deal with bad choices? Absolutely. But in a moment of affliction, we are called to weep with those who weep. Not diagnose the problem of those who weep. Not try to fix it. Just to be there. That's what Job's crying out. The Expositor's Bible Commentary had a line on this particular section. I liked it so much, I figured I'd quote it. It says, deserted by loved ones, Job needs radical friendship, not theological banter. Job doesn't need to know the cosmic reasons for why he might be in his position. He just needs someone to lean on. I pray that when we are offered the opportunity to meet someone in suffering, that we are someone who can be leaned on, not someone who tries to kick them while they're down, no matter how holy it might sound. But again, Job, though his friends have failed him, has a burst of hope. And this time it is real hope. Job begins to realize, my friends are not going to offer me any answers, but maybe I've been looking in the wrong place. Maybe I've been looking on the wrong level, if you will. Maybe I need to raise my eyes. And Job states something that probably is familiar to us. He says in verse 25, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. That line, I know that my Redeemer lives, we have that in songs. We have that in, we'll come and we'll use them in prayers. We'll talk about, we'll even do sermons on it. But do you realize that that cry comes from a person in deep sorrow and pain? When we say those words in the modern day, we mean Jesus. We mean my Redeemer, Jesus lives. That's not what Job means. When Job cries out, my Redeemer lives, he is looking up at the very God he thinks is destroying him. And you might say, well, that doesn't make sense, though. Why would Job call on God if he thinks God is destroying him? It could be because Job's a human being, and Job also doesn't understand why he's going through what he's going through. And it could also be that as Job laments, as he pours out his heart, as he takes the pain and, like the later scriptures would say, offers them to God, maybe Job is beginning to realize the God that you guys keep talking about, the one who is all wrath and judgment and pain, he also has other aspects that if I were to lean on him, perhaps he will hear my cry and restore me. And so Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. My heart faints within me. That feigning is not a bad feigning. It's a good feigning. He's thinking to himself, what a wonderful thought that my Redeemer lives. That one day, even if it requires me to be resurrected from the grave, I will stand before God. And in that moment, I will lean on his mercy. I will lean on his love, and he will take care of me. Job is remembering what his friends have forgotten. It's something that John would say pretty clearly later on. God is love. And I can trust in that. Job is beginning to hope. And there we come to our first answer today. Why do we suffer? Suffering strips away false hope. Prior to Job's suffering, if Job has a flaw, it seems to be that he hoped in his own righteousness. He trusted in his own righteousness. One of the things Job will be rebuked for later on is that when he went to God, he justified himself rather than God. Now that doesn't mean Job's a bad person, but it means Job at some point had misplaced the priorities. He had begun to see his goodness as the means of success. But now he's realizing, I was hoping in the wrong thing. Now this stuff that I was hoping in, my family, my wealth, even my health, I realize now these were all temporary. These were all momentary things that no matter how good they are, no matter how wonderful they are, eventually they were going to pass away. There is only one who does not change. Only one who is eternal. Only one who one day will stand in judgment of us all. He is the only one who I can really hope in. Job was righteous and blameless. But even Job realizes that doesn't mean I'm perfect. I could never really lean on my own goodness. Job now realizes I must lean on God's goodness. It's not an easy answer to accept. It requires some humility. It requires us to set down basically all the wisdom of this world. The wisdom of the world says, build up a nest egg. The wisdom of the world says you can always trust family. And hey, that'd be wonderful if you could, but we all know that's not always true. The wisdom of the world says take care of yourself, live to be 100. And hey, that'd be fantastic if it was true. But it's not always true. These things that we place our hope in, they're temporary. There is only one who is forever. This moment of hope for Job, though, is not merely a moment of hope. It's also a moment of warning. Because Job goes on right after I remember that I put this in here this morning. FYI, I had 2 hours of sleep last night. I don't recommend trying to preach a sermon and get a toddler into a new sleep schedule at the same time. I'm finding out it doesn't work all that well. In Romans 5, Paul spoke of suffering. He said in verse 3, not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Notice what Paul does not say. Paul does not say suffering is there because we made mistakes. He does not say suffering is punishment for our sins. He does not say suffering is something that we have to go through to teach us lessons. It produces something in us, but he doesn't say its purpose is to teach us something valuable, life lesson type thing that we like to throw around because it sounds nice. No, Paul says the purpose of suffering is to reveal hope. And that hope is God's love. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Suffering points to what true hope is, and that true hope is that God is love. But again, there's also warning. Job goes on to say to his friends, if you say, how we will pursue him, and the root of the matter is found in him, be afraid of the sword. For wrath brings the punishment of the sword, that you may know there is a judgment. What is Job saying? Well, consider this. How happy do you think a God of love would be if we go and dig up the sins of somebody, the sins that he buried, the sins that he wrapped up and threw far away? How happy do you think he'll be with us on Judgment Day when we went with a shovel and tried to resurrect all the faults of someone that we were trying to fix? In that moment, I don't think love is going to be all that wonderful for us. I think it will become fearful. Because how dare we rebel against the love of a perfect God? How dare we try to say, God, your love has to stop right there. They need to pay for this sin. We need to be very careful about how willing we are to pass judgment on people. Does that mean God never judges folks? No, by no means. God does judge. But the New Testament's very clear. We are where we are because of God's great grace. We are where we are because of His great love for us, and we have no right to go to someone else and try to withhold that love. To try to tell them, you can have that love when you get your life together. When you stop being a sinner, then you can come to Christ. Then you can come to the love of a great God. No, we need to be very careful about ever standing in the way of perfect love. Because at that moment, love stops to be a comfort to us, and it becomes a sword. Do you remember in the Garden of Gethsemane? They're coming to take Jesus, and what does Peter do? He pulls out a sword and he cuts off an ear. And what does Jesus do? Does Jesus say, way to go, Peter, you got him? Does he say, way to go, that's exactly what I want you to fight for me? No, Jesus reaches down, picks up the ear, and heals the man. Then he tells Peter, put your sword away. Because those who would live by the sword will die by the sword. Why is it we're so willing to pick up our sword when it comes to other people? Why is it we're so willing to cast stones when we know we've been forgiven of so much? The love of God is immense. The love of God gives hope in suffering, but it also is a warning to us. Those who would judge other people who are going through a trial, be very careful about what we say. Be very careful about how we act, because that love can become wrath if we should stand between it and that which it loves. Any answer for suffering which would ignore the love of God is no answer at all. Love is the foundation of Scripture. It is what drives Genesis to Revelation. And if our answer for suffering does not include God's love, we should probably just stop where we are, because it's not worth saying. 1 John 4:8. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. Job is remembering God is love. I will lean on my Redeemer. That brings us now to the third cycle. I'm not going to have any of Job's friends in the third cycle. They do have speeches, but they don't really offer anything new. Instead, I want to look at what Job says to God. Because even though Job is beginning to get more hopeful, and you can see Job, he's slowly getting in the right direction, he's still in a place of darkness. And he's going to ask some questions that sometimes we get uncomfortable with. He's going to say things that we can sometimes even tell other people, you're not allowed to ask God that question. You're not allowed to question God about that stuff, but which God's going to be quite all right with answering Job about. Job says in chapter 23, he asks a question which ironically many people today think is unanswerable. They think they're coming up with some novel thing when they ask it. Job asks, where is God? Where is God in my suffering? Where is God in the suffering of the world? He says in 23 verse 3, oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seed. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. Now, ironically, when Job does come face to face with God, he very quickly reverses that. He realizes, I should not have tried to come to God with arguments. I should have come to God with humility. But Job asked the age-old question, God, where are you? Where are you in all this? It always amuses me when I hear people say something like, where is God in this tragedy? As if somehow they've come upon the unanswerable question. I have bad news for you. Job beat you by a few thousand years. The Bible is more than willing to ask the question, where is God in suffering? And it is more than willing to give the answer. But we're not at the answer yet. That'll happen next week. Job asks, where is God in all this? And then he turns his attention to the world. He looks at the rest of the world, the suffering that seems indiscriminate out there. He says, why are not times of judgment kept by the Almighty? And why do those who know him never see his days? Why is it that all this stuff is happening and God doesn't seem to step in? Then Job goes down a long list. He goes down a long list of injustices, whether they be social or moral. He goes down a list. We're not going to repeat them all, but one of the examples, speaking of the poor, he says, they go about naked without clothing. Hungry, they carry the sheaves. What Job is saying is, why would God allow that? Why would God allow someone who is poor and in need to suffer like this? Where is he? Now, Job doesn't get his answer yet. He will get his answer. We'll look at that next week. But there is an answer. It's not the easy answer. It's not the answer I'd like to give people, but it is an answer. And the answer is simply this. Even in the midst of suffering, God is sovereign, and He is in control. But God's purpose is not your happiness. It's not a very fun thing to tell someone. It's not the kind of thing that just piles people into the seats on a Sunday morning, but the fact of the matter is, God is not really concerned with whether you're happy in this life. God is concerned with whether you are restored to Him for eternity. And if the way to restoration is through fire, then He is willing to let you go through fire. That doesn't mean you have to. It doesn't mean you must go through pain. But it does mean that when we go through trials, when we see evil, when we see suffering, don't equate that with God not caring. I remember the day after 9/11. I remember the Sunday after 9/11. It is questionable that more people have ever been in church in America than that Sunday. Because through suffering, people were beginning to realize maybe we can't just trust in our wealth. Maybe we can't just trust in our own safety here in America. Maybe we're not impregnable. Maybe we need someone greater. Through suffering, we were pointed to a greater reality. Now, unfortunately, we did not keep that lesson with us. But the fact of the matter is, if America has to fall to bring people to God, God will let America fall. And if we have to fall to get closer to God, God will let us fall. Because He's not concerned with whether or not we have nice roads and a lot of money in the bank. He is concerned with our eternity. People ask, where is God in suffering? He's right where He's always been. The question is, where are we going in suffering? Who are we turning to? Are we willing to lay down our pride that says, I'm not going to follow unless I have what is good in this life? Are we willing to lay that down and instead say, God, I come before you, humble and ready to be restored? Job, even though he cries out, where is God? He is moving towards that answer of restoration. He is realizing, maybe I have been trusting in the wrong thing. He trusted in what sounded holy. He trusted in his righteousness. He trusted he was good enough, but now he's realizing, maybe the whole time I should have been trusting in God, the God who is good. And he'll kind of explain that in this particular chapter. Chapter 28, it's a weird chapter in Job. People aren't actually sure if Job himself is the one saying these words. It's just kind of there. It's this poem about wisdom. It seems weirdly out of place in the story of Job. It almost seems like someone brought it from Proverbs or something and accidentally put it in here. And it's not clear if Job is the one speaking it or if this is one of Job's friends. It doesn't sound like Job's friends, but it also doesn't really sound like Job. And so the question is, who's saying it? For today's purposes, most scholars will still say it was Job. We're just going to go with it being Job. There's this talk about wisdom. And as it goes on, the argument is basically this. Mankind is able to do such amazing things. We're able to stop up rivers, change their direction. We're able to build mine shafts in the middle of nowhere. We can dig deep and find treasure in the earth. But is that really wisdom? Does that really answer the hard questions of life? Or does it actually shroud the hard questions? Have you ever been in a big city, like a Chicago or a New York? A city that they call it the concrete jungle. All you can see is what is man-made. It's kind of easy when you're there to start looking at it and say, wow, we're amazing. We can do awesome things. We're never going to fail. And yet when you consider it, those cities are one bomb away from rubble. Now we don't want to think about that, but that's the reality. Is it really wisdom to put our trust in what we can make, what we can build, the wealth we can store up? Job says in verse 12, "But where shall wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its worth, and it is not found in the land of the living." We build up these towers, but when it comes to the things that matter, we don't have the ability to answer them. Where is wisdom found? And it comes to this point at the end where the answer is given. God understands the way to it, and he knows its place. And then verse 28, it's a section of Scripture I'm sure you're familiar with. You probably have quoted it quite a bit, even if you didn't realize the situation it's given in. "And he said to man, Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding." Job is beginning to understand. Wisdom is not, let me get my stuff back. Wisdom is not, let me have vast fortunes and a big family. Not that there's anything wrong with those. But true wisdom, the true answer to our pain and our suffering, the true answer to our purpose in life, is to fear the Lord and to turn away from evil. Job is beginning to realize the answer was not my righteousness. It was his righteousness. That was what I was supposed to lean on. That's who I was supposed to trust. Job is realizing that he has trusted the wrong thing. He trusted his own goodness. Like I said at the beginning, Job, upright though he is, he's not completely perfect. He seems to have let some of that self-righteousness creep in. But now, as it's all been stripped away by his suffering, he's beginning to realize there was something better, something more for me to hold on to. The next couple chapters are Job just basically giving a summary defense of everything they've gone through. He goes through and kind of recaps everything. We're not going to read any of that. But Job 31 has an interesting end. It's the end of Job's speeches. In your Bible, it probably says something like Job's final appeal. Job does something curious. He gives what's called a negative testament. The negative testament goes like this: if I have done X, then may Y happen to me. It's a curious thing because Job, throughout his complaints, has basically said, I didn't do X, so why is Y happening to me? Why on earth would Job tempt fate even more by basically begging to have more trouble come his way? Well, I think it's because at the end, Job has realized, if I throw myself on my Redeemer, if I take my suffering and pain, and instead of holding on to it, instead of becoming bitter, instead of letting it become a cloud over my life, instead I take it and I bring it to God, and I say, God, I trust you to make everything right. Then in the end, whether it requires a resurrection from the dead or not, one day he will restore me. An example of what Job says in 31 is found just here at the end. He says, if my land has cried out against me, and its furrows wept together, if I have eaten its yield without payment and made its owners breathe their last, let thorns grow instead of wheat and foul weeds instead of barley. Basically, Job just says, look, if I really did sin, if I really did something wrong, then all right, God, that's fine. Come take away from me. And it's easy to see Job as trying to maintain his integrity in this. Trying to say, I didn't do any of this stuff. And there may be some of that, but I think that we're actually viewing Job humbling himself. Now putting himself fully into the arms of God, saying, you know what? I'm no longer going to try to justify myself before you. Instead, whatever you will, let it be done. In doing so, Job actually comes to our second answer. Suffering strips away false trust. It strips away our reliance on things which, though they might be good in the moment, cannot actually be leaned on. All the wealth in the world is only as good as it is until the moment you die. All your family members, no matter how wonderful they are, no matter how loving they are, will one day pass away. Eventually, everything we rely on in this world will fall. But there is one who does not. There is one who remains forever. In Lord of the Rings, at the very end of Lord of the Rings, it's one of my favorite quotes of the book. It's not a quote, it's a scene. They've thrown the ring into Mount Doom. They've completed their quest, but it's cost them everything. They think they're going to die, Frodo and Sam. The mountain is blowing up, lava everywhere, and they're outside of the mountain, laying on a pier of rock. They're just done. They're exhausted. There's nothing left for them to do. And as they're laying there, in the midst of all this chaos and destruction, Sam looks up, and for a brief moment, the clouds part. And he sees a single star. And he says, look at the star. There is still something out there, something beyond the reach of evil, something that cannot be touched by what happens down here. And it still shines bright. It's not going anywhere. I think Job, as he has come to this edge of his suffering, is realizing the same thing. I have been consumed with everything down here. I've been consumed with the pain. I've been consumed with what I go through. I've been consumed with these bad answers my friends have been giving me. But there beyond the chaos, God still reigns. He still remains shining bright, untouched by the evil of this world. That I can rely on. That I can put my trust in. It's not an easy answer. And Job still has some lessons to learn as we go through next week the end of Job's story. But it's an answer that when we humble ourselves, when we lower ourselves before God, when we say, God, even though I go through great trial, I will no longer try to fix it myself. I will no longer try to get from you on my own righteousness. Instead, God, I lay myself before you. I open myself up to your will because I know, yes, you are just and you are wrathful and you are righteousness, but you are also merciful and you are loving. And I know you won't let me be put to shame. When we do that, we begin to realize the point of suffering. It brings us back to God. The question is, can we accept that answer and move towards Him? Next week we will look at what God Himself has to say to Job. It is curious, throughout all these chapters, God never says to Job anything. He never looks down and says, Job, you're speaking wrongly on this, or yes, you're speaking right on that. No, He lets Job pour himself out. He lets Job work through his suffering. And He lets Job's friends give bad answers, but eventually God is going to answer. And He's not going to answer in the way we think that He should. He's not going to explain everything to Job. He's not going to get down and open up a big map and say, all right, Job, here was my plan all along. But His answer will be true. If you're here today and you're not a Christian, but you would like to become one, I can promise you, not happiness and joy and everything fun in this life, but I can promise you there is a God who does not change. And if you lean on Him, if you will take up His offer of redemption, on the last day when He stands on the earth, He will see you restored in love. If you would like to become a Christian, I will be in the back here as we stand and sing our invitation song. Come back and speak with me. And if you're here and you need to talk or pray with someone, again, I'll be in the back as we stand and sing.